Hi, my name is Suzanne Friedman, and I am so happy to be talking to you today about the benefits of forgiveness for your emotional and physical well being, what forgiveness is and is not, and the process of forgiveness. I am a professor of human development at the University of Northern Iowa, and I began studying the psychology of interpersonal forgiveness as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And forgiveness is a fairly new topic in the field of psychology. Before I begin, I want to share some quotes with you that I think reflect on why we need to learn about forgiveness. We reenact our past everywhere, at home, at school, at the workplace, on the playground, in the streets. We cue each other to play roles in our personal dramas, secretly hoping that someone will give us a different script, a different outcome to the drama. Is forgiveness the different script? And then another quote, the beliefs that you hold about forgiveness open or close possibilities for you, determine your willingness to forgive, and as a result, profoundly influence the emotional tone of your life. As I'm presenting today, I want you to consider the following questions. How do you define forgiveness? How did you develop this definition? What does your religion culture say about forgiveness? How does this influence you? How do you usually solve interpersonal conflicts? And how do you deal with hurt? I'd also like you to think of a situation in which you have needed to forgive someone, or someone has needed to forgive you, or you have needed to forgive yourself. What was that process like for you? Were you able to forgive? Was it a struggle? Were you told to forgive by others? What were the consequences of forgiving or being forgiven? The definition of forgiveness is given by Enright, who states, when unjustly hurt by another, we forgive when we overcome the resentment toward the offender, not by denying our right to the resentment, but instead by trying to offer the offender compassion, benevolence, and love. As we give these, we as forgivers realize that the offender does not necessarily have a right to such gifts. Two important points in this definition is that we don't deny our right to feel resentment after being hurt. And the offender, because of how they hurt us, they don't necessarily have a right to our compassion, benevolence, and love. They don't necessarily deserve it, but we give it anyway. A definition more easily understood and applied is forgiveness is the overcoming of negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors directed at an offender, and perhaps over time, gradually developing positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors toward the offender. Questions to consider when we think about the definition is whether forgiveness needs to include the presence of positive thoughts, feelings, and actions, or could it just be the cessation of negative thoughts, feelings, and actions? How is forgiveness different than excusing or condoning the unjust action? Can someone forgive without forgetting? And is there any act beyond the scope of forgiveness? Does authentic forgiveness necessarily involve reconciliation with the offender? Is forgiveness a decision or a process of many decisions? This presentation will hopefully answer all of these questions. General guidelines for forgiveness. Although I gave the definition of forgiveness, these guidelines will help your understanding of what exactly forgiveness is and isn't. Forgiveness is not for everyone. As a graduate student studying forgiveness, My good friend told me, you do the forgiveness group, I'll do the revenge group. Let's see who gets more people. So, forgiveness is always a choice. No one should be forced into forgiving. And for some people, it just might not be for them. When we talk about forgiveness, we need to center it in moral issues as well as psychology or self help. It's more than just a self help strategy because when we forgive, we are taking the offender into consideration, which I'll touch upon later on in this presentation. Interpersonal forgiveness is between people, not between a person and an inanimate object. We don't talk about forgiving tornadoes, floods, or institutions. I teach a class on interpersonal forgiveness at the university, and my students sometimes talk about forgiving an institution, the university, or a hospital. And I always tell them that they need to find someone specific in the hospital or in the institution to forgive. Contrary to popular belief, forgiveness takes time. It does not occur overnight. Sometimes people hear in their religious organizations that they should forgive immediately. If you've been deeply, personally, and unfairly hurt, you're not able usually to forgive right away. And I will be discussing a 20-unit model that we have developed for the process of forgiveness. And to work through those 20 units, it takes some time. Incest survivors in my dissertation study, I educated them about the process of forgiveness, and it took them on an average of 14.3 months to forgive. So depending on the severity of the injury, that is related to the amount of time it may take someone to forgive. Forgiveness follows a deep, personal, and unfair hurt. The injury might be psychological, emotional, physical, or moral. So even though we commonly hear, please forgive me for being 5 minutes late, please forgive me for stepping on your toe, we talk about forgiveness in the context of deep, personal, and unfair hurt. For being 5 minutes late, it might be better to say, please excuse me for being 5 minutes late. Please excuse me for stepping on your toe. Forgiveness is possible only when a person first has a sense of justice, meaning that we won't know that forgiveness is needed unless we know that we've been wrongly hurt. And Smedes, the author of the book, How to Forgive When You Can't Forget, talks about the difference between being hurt and wronged. We can be hurt, but we might not need to forgive. But when we are wronged, forgiveness isn't often an appropriate response. Usually there's an initial reaction by the injured person towards the injurer. The hurt is experienced as profound, followed by shock, disbelief, anger, and even hatred. Although forgiveness is often criticized because people don't recognize the role of anger in the process, anger is a very important part of the forgiveness process. It is the second unit and really the first phase in the four-phase model focuses on the expression of anger. Before one can forgive, they need to admit to, identify, and express their anger about being hurt. Forgiveness helps people so that they don't get sick with feelings. And our society doesn't do a very good job of helping people understand that anger is a natural and normal emotion, and it's what we do with our anger that can be considered good or bad. I just heard a podcast in which the speaker was talking about how in her family, anger wasn't accepted. If she showed anger, she was given a consequence. So we have to do a better job of validating people for their anger and helping them express anger, especially when they've been deeply hurt. When one begins the forgiveness process, he or she may not feel like forgiving. However, it's important to know that the decision to forgive can be made with the knowledge that the beginning steps in the process will facilitate feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that promote an attitude of forgiveness. So you can make the decision to forgive even though you don't feel like forgiving at that moment. And usually, in order to forgive, we need to feel an inner push to forgive. Lewis Smedes talks about this. We probably won't do much forgiving unless something inside of us makes us want to do it. Perhaps this is the realization that our anger is getting old or tiring, and we want to do something different with our negative feelings. One does not need to be religious to be able to forgive. Forgiveness is often associated with religion, but you can forgive and not be religious. Sometimes religion helps people make the decision to forgive. It helps them on their journey towards forgiveness, but you don't need to be a religious person to choose to forgive. And we can only forgive for the pain that wounds us personally. Hurt my child, you hurt me. However, I can only forgive for the way that I was hurt when my child was hurt. Only my child can make the decision to forgive for the way that they were hurt. One of the first signs that forgiveness is taking place is that the person is no longer thinking about revenge or seeking retaliation. We surrender our right to get even when we begin the forgiveness process. However, we don't give up justice. We may give up our vengeful feelings, but we don't give up the right for justice. Vengeance is personal satisfaction, and justice is moral accounting. A big misconception about forgiveness is that we need to receive an apology from the offender before we can forgive. Although apologies make forgiving easier, they are not necessary. If we said that we had to receive an apology from the offender before we can forgive, we are putting our own healing in the hands of the offender. Apologies may be necessary for reconciliation, meaning I wouldn't want to get together or back in a relationship with someone who hurt me, who didn't admit to the wrongdoing or apologize. But I can work on forgiveness without that apology. In fact, one can forgive without the offender even knowing about it. The offender doesn't need to have intended the wrong. It did not have to be done on purpose to require forgiveness. So intent is not necessary to forgive. Lots of people use that as a requirement of whether they will forgive or not. Some people say if they were intentionally hurt, they won't forgive. Forgiveness in those situations may be more difficult, but forgiveness is still possible. The process of forgiveness is not natural. Instead, it's one of the hardest things in life to do, and there is often much difficulty associated with forgiveness. Although we talk about forgiving, people really aren't given many instructions or told how to forgive, and it doesn't come naturally. And that's why education about forgiveness is so important. Although a person can make the choice to forgive on his or her own, the process often requires the help of another supportive person, a good friend, a counselor, an educator. And the difficulty in arriving at a forgiveness solution varies with external variables, such as the severity of the injury, the quality of relationship prior to the injury, time since the injury, and the person's ability to understand forgiveness. I often ask students in my interpersonal forgiveness class whether they think it's easier to forgive a stranger or a family member. Some people say a stranger because they don't have expectations from the stranger of not hurting them. Some students say family because they have positive memories as well as the hurtful incident to recall. It's important that we don't ask someone to forgive right after they've been deeply hurt. We need to give them time to process what happened, to get over their shock of the injury. In my intervention study with incest survivors, I didn't want the incest to have occurred in the last 2 years before beginning the intervention. And that really wasn't an issue since the participants were adults. But I wanted to make sure that they had time before they began considering forgiveness. An offended person may injure the offender. Thus, forgiveness could be relational and an offended offender is possible. When we begin the forgiveness process, one of the first signs that it's occurring is that we may feel a real wish that good things might come the offender's way. And it's important to know that we forgive persons for what they do, not who they are. We don't forgive people for being lazy or arrogant or bad people. People wrong us by their actions, not by who they are. As Enright emphasizes, forgiveness is not the only answer to interpersonal conflict, deep hurt, and social problems, but part of a solution that has been rarely discussed and tried. As stated by a college student in my interpersonal forgiveness class, I think I am surprised that to this day, I actually haven't had a therapist help me with the forgiveness process, which is why I personally want to help others start the process. It's important to talk about what forgiveness isn't, as well as talk about what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not the same as pardoning. Pardoning could be public, where forgiveness is personal. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. That is another big misconception when we talk about forgiveness. People think we mean that you have to enter into a relationship with the person who hurt you, or you have to maintain the relationship. So when people say that they do not want to forgive, what they may really mean is they do not want to stay in a relationship with the person who hurt them. Forgiveness can lead to reconciliation, but it doesn't have to. Someone can forgive from afar, knowing that it might not be safe to reconcile, or it might not be possible. The person may no longer be in contact with the person who hurt them. The offender could also have passed away, and it is still possible to forgive the person. Forgiveness is not condoning or excusing. When we forgive, we are stating that we were unfairly hurt and that we did not deserve to be hurt. Forgiveness is not denial or indifference. The whole first phase of the forgiveness process requires admitting that we were hurt, which is hard because lots of times we don't want to feel the pain of the way we were hurt or the pain of the injury. And that's a reason that many people deny that they were hurt, because admitting to and dealing with the pain takes courage. It isn't easy. And forgiveness isn't forgetting. We often hear the popular phrase, forgive and forget. But when you experience a deep hurt, you're not going to forget it. When I was hurt by a good friend, I could forgive that friend, but I'm not going to forget the way that she hurt me. However, I may not think about it as often, and when I do think about it, the feelings aren't as intense. So we may forgive or we may forget minor things, but deep injuries are rarely forgotten, even though they could be forgiven. And forgiveness is not simply a diminishing of angry feelings over time. Our anger definitely decreases when we forgive, but it's more than that, because we do take the offender into consideration. We do try to expand our view of who the offender is, and we do develop empathy and compassion for the offender. And forgiveness is not an exclusive self-centering. I'm a runner and I can go out running if I'm angry and upset at my husband, and I may feel better when I come back from my run, but that doesn't mean that I've forgiven my husband. Like I said before, when we are engaging in forgiving an offender, we do begin to think more positively towards that person. And it's not just about how we feel as the one who was hurt. And it's important to know that forgiveness is not mutually exclusive with justice. Justice can occur if someone broke the law. Someone can be fined, can go to prison, and we can personally, individually work on the forgiveness process. Just because we forgive does not mean that justice does not occur. This was a statement made by a student in my interpersonal forgiveness class, and I thought it was a great illustration of what many of us think forgiveness means or the way forgiveness has been illustrated to us. She stated, "Forgiveness is being dragged by your arm into the grocery store and told to apologize to the manager for stealing a pack of fruit stripe gum. Forgiveness is feeling like you have to reply, 'It's okay,' after someone pushes you down and mutters sorry in your direction. Forgiveness is blocking out the memory of a fist punching a hole in the wall after you asked for help with the kids. Forgiveness is actually none of these scenarios, but that's what I had understood it to be: apologies, reluctant acceptance, and amnesia. We are taught to say we're sorry, whether we feel remorse or not. We are expected to accept apologies because otherwise we are seen as stubborn and petty. Finally, we have to forget the injustices that we endure because it makes life easier for everyone around us. I see a lot of this happening in schools and with children. When a child does something to hurt another child or individual, we automatically tell them to say they're sorry, even before giving them a chance to really feel remorse for what they've done. And we tell the victim, the individual that was hurt, to accept the apology right away, even before we worked through their feelings. I think as a society, we need to do a better job of helping children and adolescents and adults take responsibility for their actions, truly come to a place where they feel remorse and reflect on why what they did was hurtful and wrong, and then make a genuine apology. We also have to do a better job of allowing an individual who's been hurt to forgive on their own timeline. Someone can receive an apology and tell the offender that they appreciate the apology and they're working on forgiveness and they'll get there, but right now they're still angry. I want to talk about the 5 foundational concepts of forgiveness. The first one is the idea of inherent worth. And inherent worth is the important idea that all people have deep worth because they are members of the human family. This deep worth cannot be earned or taken away. It is an essential part of each person. According to Lewis Smedes, when we forgive, we rediscover the humanity of the person who hurt us. We change our view of the offender. We see the offender as a person who shares our faulty humanity, bruised like us, faulty like us, still thoroughly blamable, yet also human. So oftentimes after we've been hurt, we see the offender maybe just as the monster who hurt us. In the forgiveness process, we have to recognize that the offender, no matter what they did, is a human being who is imperfect as we are. And I have a quote from a participant in my dissertation study, an incest survivor, and she stated, "There is not a day that goes by where I don't think about how much my participation in your group changed my life and my attitude. Forgiveness is not just an act, it's a way of life. My strongest beliefs are not necessarily religious ones, but ones rooted in Mother Teresa's idea that we cannot hate someone whose story we know. Part of what I learned from you was that opening myself more about what may have happened to my father in his own childhood made it possible for me to understand that he too may have been a victim of abuse. She expanded her view of her father, who was her abuser, saw him as a human being, and looked into his past to see that he could have been abused as well. Moral love is an important foundational concept of forgiveness, and it means to love someone unconditionally despite their flaws. However, someone who morally loves someone can also ask fairness of them. And when we forgive, we are showing generosity. We are giving abundantly. We offer the gift of forgiveness without any strings attached. We don't require an apology. We don't require necessarily a change in behavior for forgiveness to take place. As I said before, those might be important requirements for reconciliation, but not necessarily forgiveness. When we forgive, we show kindness. When people are kind, they tend to be warm hearted. They're concerned about the other person and they're acting humanely. People who practice kindness are laying the foundation for forgiving. I'm teaching fifth graders about forgiveness right now, and we talk a lot about what it means to be kind and how um, being kind is important, not just to people who are kind to us, but even to people who aren't kind to us. And I define that as radical kindness to the fifth graders, and they came up with the word raging kindness as well. That when we are practicing radical kindness, we're kind to everybody, not just to the people who show kindness to us. We also show respect when we engage in the process of forgiveness. When we respect someone, we regard the other person highly. We believe, following the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, that people possess intrinsic value, that we would respect all people. We respect people not because what they do, but because of who they are, because they exist as a human being. And I worked with at risk adolescents, and they had experienced some pretty deep hurts. And it is hard to realize that we should respect someone after they have hurt us so much. But this is an important part of the forgiveness process, the recognition that all people are human beings and deserve respect. And we see this right now in the criminal justice system, with the realization that just because someone has committed a crime and is in prison, that doesn't mean that we can treat them inhumanely, but we can give them a consequence. They're serving their punishment by staying in prison, serving a prison sentence, but that does not mean that we shouldn't respect them as a human being. There's been a great deal of research conducted on forgiveness, and some of the places and populations that forgiveness education and intervention has occurred has been in the schools, um, with couple counseling for marriages, in inpatient drug rehab centers. We've done forgiveness interventions with elderly women, parentally love deprived college students, incest survivors, as I've mentioned, women who have experienced emotional abuse, men who were upset by their partner's decision to have an abortion, college students who have experienced a variety of hurts, at risk adolescents, middle school students hurt as a result of their parents' divorce. Now that you have a better understanding, hopefully, of what it means to forgive and how we define forgiveness, I want to talk to you a little bit about our model of forgiveness and how it was developed. Um, so, this model was rationally derived, meaning one doesn't do the work of forgiving before deciding to forgive. And most people don't consciously consider forgiving when deeply hurt by another. In my college course, students frequently remark how they wish they had been educated about forgiveness when they were in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, that it would have saved them a lot of hurt and pain, and they think this should be a part of the curriculum. Most people need to be taught about forgiveness to begin forgiving. Something to think about is who taught you about forgiveness? Where did you learn how to forgive and what it means to forgive? Were you just told to forgive without given any instructions? And this quote from a student in my class really illustrates the importance of educating others about forgiveness and the forgiveness process. No matter how my own healing process continues to unfold, and no matter what conflicting feelings I might have about my mother attending my graduation in May, I am grateful right now to know that forgiveness is an option, to know forgiveness is a healthy option, and to know I have the information and support I need to keep going on my healing journey. As a human who has suffered, I now have faith in the healing potential of forgiveness, even as I am still working towards giving that gift to my offender. As a counseling student, I am now genuinely awed by the possibility of forgiveness as an option for my clients to consider in their own healing journeys. I just wrote a blog post about how forgiveness connects to hope and why making the decision to forgive can be very hopeful for individuals. I want to talk to you about Robert Enright and colleagues' process model of forgiveness. I didn't say it earlier, but Robert Enright is considered the founding father of forgiveness, and he was my graduate school advisor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written multiple books on forgiveness, and one of his books is Forgiveness is a Choice, and I highly recommend it if you want more information about forgiveness and the process of forgiveness. I use it in my college class. And the model is viewed as a flexible set of processes with feedback and feed forward loops. So, not every individual will need to go through every unit in the process model of forgiveness. You may skip some, you may need to go back and rework through some units, but it's very flexible. The model of forgiveness includes 4 phases and 20 units. And like I said, some may skip entire units in the process. And as I said earlier, forgiveness cannot be rushed. A person needs to give themselves time and patience when embarking on the forgiveness journey. When one makes a decision to forgive, it may initially be motivated out of self interest, meaning that you may choose to forgive because you want to feel better, and that's perfectly fine. During the process of forgiveness, you will begin to take the offender into consideration. As I said, the forgiver will focus more on the offender than the self. The uncovering phase is the first phase in the model of forgiveness that I'll talk about right now. And during this phase, the individual becomes aware of the emotional pain that has resulted from a deep unjust injury. Characteristic feelings of anger or even hatred may be present. As these negative emotions are confronted and explored, individuals may experience considerable emotional distress. Deciding on the appropriate amount of energy to process this pain while still functioning effectively is an important consideration during this phase. As the anger and other negative emotions are brought out into the open, healing can begin to occur. I took this description from the International Forgiveness Institute, and there is the website. If you're looking for more information about forgiveness, I encourage you to Google the International Forgiveness Institute. I will go through the specific units that make up the uncovering phase now. And the first unit that a person has to go through is the psychological defenses. As I said earlier, when you begin the forgiveness process, you have to break down the defenses that maybe you've used to effectively cope with the way you've been hurt. So, for example, the incest survivors I worked with, oftentimes they repress or suppress the abuse they've experienced. They may rationalize the abuse, saying the offender didn't mean it. He may have been drunk when he abused me. Um, they may displace their anger and hurt on other people. One needs to admit to their feelings, admit to their pain before they can um, move on in the forgiveness process. So, breaking down any psychological defenses that one may have used um, to cope, to be able to, exist and function even after they were hurt. Um, Often defense mechanisms are put in place because they protect an individual, but after a while, they begin to block true healing. The second unit, as I've mentioned before, is the confrontation of anger. An individual often may have buried their anger, but they need to admit to being angry. They need to recognize it. They need to identify it. Um, I was just listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, and she talks about the importance of naming one's emotions to be able to productively work through them. And a student in my interpersonal class on forgiveness says this about um, anger. Enright's model of forgiveness forces a victim to break their anger down into detail. The first phase of the model includes questions a victim has to ask themselves about why they are angry. Have they faced their anger yet? How the anger has affected them? This, for me at least, is probably the most difficult part of the process. This is why I haven't forgiven yet. It is hard and it is painful. I, like most people, have chosen for a long time to suppress my anger until it comes out in bursts or waves. I then tell myself, I'm fine and it's nothing, and suppress again until more bursts or waves come up. It has even affected my personality. I sometimes don't know who I am anymore. This quote really illustrates um, the negative effects of repressing or suppressing one's anger. Coming to grips with guilt and shame may be an experience for individuals. Not everybody feels guilty or shame in relation to the way they were hurt, but some people may. And realizing the appropriate amount of guilt and shame that one needs to feel after they were hurt is important. Um, in my work with incest survivors, they often felt a lot of shame about the sexual abuse they experienced, and helping them realize that they're not the only one who has experienced abuse or that they did nothing to deserve the abuse is important. Preoccupation with pain refers to after being injured, a person may have a hard time about thinking about anything else. They may find themselves crying and emotionally feeling their pain, and coming to a point where they're able to still function their daily life without feeling the pain is important. And that's the same with cognitively reliving the event. They may find themselves washing the dishes or going about their job, and they can't think about anything else other than the way they were hurt. And oftentimes, I may, when I'm working with someone who's been deeply hurt, tell them to think about what happened to them, feel the pain in the morning, maybe for 20 minutes, and at night, 20 minutes. And then all other times of the day, try not to think about it or feel the pain if possible. Another step that people might experience when they're in the uncovering phase is comparison of self with the offender. They may inaccurately think that the offender is doing fine and doesn't have any pain, and helping them get an accurate view of the offender is an important step in the forgiveness journey. It's also important to think about the way you've been changed as a result of the abuse or hurt that you've experienced. Oftentimes, people may focus on the negative, but they may also experience positive ways they've been changed. I think of the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that was written by Rabbi Harold Kushner, and he lost a child to cancer. And he talks about how, as a result of his experience and losing his son, he became a much more effective rabbi. He was able to recognize that change. However, if you asked him, he says he would much rather have been the ineffective rabbi who had his son back. So just because you can recognize positive ways that you've been changed, it's not saying that you're glad or grateful for the way you've been hurt. After being deeply hurt, you may have new insight into the world and the fairness. Lots of times, people's view of the world is that if I do good things, the world will be good to me. And after being deeply hurt, a person may realize that um, bad things happen to people all the time, and it is quite random. So their hypothesis about the fairness of the world often changes after experiencing a deep hurt. Um, the decision phase is results or follows after the uncovering phase. In the decision phase, the individual may realize that the way they've been focusing and coping with the injury is not working, is continuing to cause suffering, and they begin to understand that a change must occur to go ahead in the healing process. The person may experience a change of heart or a life change in a positive direction. The individual then entertains the idea of forgiveness as a healing strategy and commits to forgiving the offender. Complete forgiveness is not yet realized, even though an individual makes the decision to explore forgiveness and takes the initial steps in the direction of full forgiveness. So, in the decision phase, like I said, an individual realizes that the way they've been coping with the hurt is no longer working for them. They want to do something different. That might be the realization that anger is getting old and tiring. Initially, the anger felt powerful. They were justified in being angry about what happened to them. But after a while, it's very draining. It's affecting their relationships with other people. Their willingness to consider forgiveness as an option. I kind of relate this to exploring what forgiveness is and isn't. So before you make the commitment to forgive, you want to find out more information about forgiveness. Just like before you buy a new car, you may do some research. What car has the best gas mileage? What car has the best safety record? So you explore what's involved in forgiveness. And then you make the commitment to forgive the offender, even though the feelings might not be there. The work phase is the actual phase where the individual begins the active work that gets them to the feelings of forgiveness. And this phase may include new ways of thinking about the offender. The individual strives to under the offender's childhood or perhaps put the injurious event in context by understanding the pressures the injurer was under at the time of the offense. So, what this means is that we try to expand our view of the offender. We try to understand how and why they hurt us, not to make excuses, not to say that it's okay what they did, but to better understand what was going on with that person that they were able to hurt us in such a deep way. And like I said, it's to better understand them and see the person as a member of the human community. When we're able to expand our view, we often develop empathy and compassion towards that person. And reframing is the first step in the work phase. And here's a quote from one of the incest survivors in my dissertation study. She states, reframing allowed me to see my father as not just an individual who committed an act against me, but someone who most likely grew up in an incestuous family himself. And I saw him as a bigger part of a bigger picture and realized that not all the blame lay with him, that in many ways he was a victim too, which is not to absolve him. And forgiveness is not saying it's okay what he did and I really wasn't hurt by it. It's not that at all. I'm angry at what he did and still have very horrifying images, but I am angry at what he did and not at him anymore. And that's a big difference. When we're able to reframe and expand our view of the person, we often feel empathy, or the beginning of empathy develops. And for example, with the incest survivor who recognized or learned that her father was also abused, that allowed her to feel empathy. When I work with the fifth graders, I get sunglasses from the dollar store and I call them magic glasses. And I have them put on their magic glasses so they can also think about the person who hurt them in other ways than just the person who hurt them. I ask them if they have any positive memories or they can think of any positive things about the person who hurt them, and to recall that the person who hurt them is a human being. Feelings of compassion, they also develop along with empathy. And Unit 15 is acceptance and absorption of pain. And this is the heart of forgiveness. Um, when we can accept and absorb the pain that results from the actions of the offender. This doesn't mean that we say that we're deserving of the pain, but it's this understanding that we are going to bear the pain and deal with it rather than pass it on to someone else. This is often where the challenge of a quest for the good is most evident. The individual may now become ready to begin to offer goodwill towards the offender. Maybe it takes the form of merciful restraint where we don't get revenge. We show generosity and moral love. This doesn't have to include reconciliation. So, what it means to accept and absorb the pain is in the cases of abuse, abuse is often intergenerational. And when someone accepts and absorbs the pain, it means that the buck stops with them. They're not going to pass the pain on to anybody else because they're going to deal with it. Linda Sanford, the author of the book Strong at the Broken Places, talks about how we can't control what happens to us as children or the parents that we are given, but how we cope with the abuse we experienced as a child or the hurt we experienced is up to us as an adult. In the outcome and the deepening phase, the forgiving individual begins to realize that they are gaining emotional relief from the process of forgiving. They may find meaning in their suffering and in the forgiveness process. The emotional relief and newfound meaning may lead to increased compassion for oneself and others. The individual may discover a new purpose in life, an active concern for his or her community. And the forgiver discovers the paradox of forgiveness. As we give to others the gifts of mercy, generosity, and moral love, we ourselves are healed. The steps in the outcome and deepening phase, which is the last phase in the model. Like I said, we find meaning for self and others in the suffering and in the forgiveness process. Viktor Frankl talks about this. The example I gave before about Rabbi Harold Kushner, finding meaning for self, how he was changed in a positive way. Unit 17 is the realization that you have needed forgiveness from other people, that you maybe have hurt others and needed their forgiveness. That helps you begin to extend forgiveness as well. You realize that you are not alone in your forgiveness journey. Other people have been deeply hurt. And you realize that you may have a new purpose in your life because of the injury. Oftentimes, after someone's been deeply hurt, they may devote themselves to helping others. They may develop a career in counseling, one of the incest survivors wanted to go into counseling to help other incest survivors after going through the forgiveness process.